Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy, and it's not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or a personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalon Johnson. My guest today is Dr. Peter Levine. Dr. Levine is a pioneer in the field of trauma healing, somatic therapy, and body-centered psychology. He is a developer of Somatic Experiencing, a groundbreaking method for resolving trauma at the level where it lives in the body, not just in the mind. Over the past 5 decades, Dr. Levine's work has fundamentally changed how the world understands trauma, survival, and healing. He holds doctorates in both medical biophysics and psychology, has taught at universities and trauma centers across the globe, and has authored several best-selling books. Beyond his extraordinary professional contribution, Dr. Levine's work is deeply personal, and it springs not just from scientific inquiry, but from lived experience, from his own early encounters with terror and his lifelong quest to understand how humans can heal what once felt unhealable. Through his research, his practice, and his presence, Dr. Levine reminds us that trauma is not what happened to us. It's what happens inside of us when we're overwhelmed and alone. Dr. Levine is a living example that healing is possible when we can return to our bodies, reweave safety, and reclaim the parts of ourselves that fear tried to steal. And today, his teachings are a lifeline to millions of people around the world and a blueprint for coming home to ourselves after the rupture of trauma.
Wow, that was beautifully said, Jalon. That was beautifully said.
Thank you for that, Dr. Levine, and welcome to the show, and thank you so much for being my guest.
Sure.
I did give a brief introduction, but so that the audience can get to know you a little bit better, would you mind giving us a little bit of background about yourself and how you got to who and where you are today?
Oh, that's right. um, you know, I'm at the age where the number of years from my conception to where I am right now, and from where I am right now to when I'm no longer be able to interview me because I won't be alive anymore. And so I really thought this was a time for me to look at my life trajectory, what I learned, what I share with people, and where I'm going for this last part of my life, this twilight part of my life. A while ago, because of this, I thought it was a good time to kind of do a journal of my life, a narrative, to look at the narrative of my life. And I started to do that. And it was never meant to be anything more than a journal, than a personal journal. But a very dear friend of mine asked what I was writing, and I said it, and she asked if it was okay for her to look it over, to read it. And I was a little bit hesitant, but I said, okay. And then she said, well, I assume you're going to write this as a book. And I said, no, it's just too vulnerable, too revealing. And it was really just for my own navigation. And she said, well, I really do think that if in your story, you could help others write their own stories. And I believe, and you started talking about that, Jalad, that we all have our stories to tell. And no one's story is any better than anyone else's story. And I took the privilege to tell my story, but I also encourage others to tell their stories, to kind of follow the arc of their lives. And so that led to eventually writing the autobiography of trauma. When I started to write about it, well, first of all, even though my friend really encouraged me, I thought, nope, it's just, again, it's too revealing. It's too vulnerable.
Hmm.
And he said, well, I hope you think about it. And I did, but I couldn't come to any decision whether I would, write it as a book. And I've written a bunch of books that you mentioned. So why write another book? And, um, and, but I couldn't make up my mind. I trusted her perception, but I also, felt vulnerable to print it, to publish it. And so in this time of indecision, and it was indecision, often in my life, when I don't know what the next step is going to be, or I'm unable to make a decision about something, a dream will come to me. And in this case, the dream was where I'm standing in front of this large field, this large meadow. And in both of my hands, I'm holding what looks like the pages of a manuscript. And I look to the left and I look to the right. And again, I just am in a state of indecision. But in that state, this wind, this strong breeze comes from behind me and takes all of these pages and takes them into the wind to land in the meadow, to land where they would land. And so when I woke from that dream, I knew that even though my conscious mind couldn't make the decision, my unconscious mind already had. And that's, again, one of the things I've learned in my life is that I'm a relatively smart person, but my unconscious mind is much smarter than I am. And I think that's true for most of us. When we choose and take the opportunity to enter into our dream world, to take our dreams seriously, some beautiful things can start to happen. So that was the decision to write this as a book, and to put it out to help people tell their stories and about their traumas, and about how my healing could also help other people, could inform other people for their own healing. So that's kind of the story of this last book, and so here we are talking about it. And there's a Greek figure in Greek mythology, a Greek archetype called Chiron. And Chiron is about the wounded healer. And all of us who are in the healing arts, as therapists, as healers of other kinds, we owe it not just to ourselves, but to those we minister to do our own healing, to do our own work. And that's been a guiding light for me throughout my whole life. So while I've, worked over the years with literally thousands of people, I knew that I had to do my work first. That without doing my own healing work, I would be limited into how I could help others.
Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for the work that you've done to help others, and for being committed to doing your own healing work. I wanted to ask, if you don't mind, what was it that your healing work consisted of, and what about sharing your story was so vulnerable that you second guessed it?
Okay, I'll try in that direction. You shared a little bit about your story, your history. And my family was under threat, under life threat from the mafia. And they told my father that if my father testified against this man named Johnny Guardo, he was the mafia person that was featured in The Goodfellas and The Irishman. When you wanted to really put the fear into others, he was the person that you would hire because he was so terrifying. You can see a picture of him in the book. He is incarnate evil. So I was starting to have some disturbing symptoms and some brief flashes, but mostly physical symptoms. And so I asked one of my students, a young woman, if she would sit with me and guide me to see where these symptoms would go. Now, one of the things, and I'll kind of also talk about, didactic parts of this, about how somatic experiencing works and how it works in the body. So we call it SE sometimes for short, somatic experiencing, SE. We don't take the person right into the trauma. We don't have them relive the trauma. There are therapies that do that, and I'm not so much a fan of them, where you're exposed to the traumatic event over and over and over again. But in SC, we looked first for a place where we felt safe, we felt cared for. And what came up when I was being guided by my therapist, when it was my birthday, I was 4 years old, and my parents must have come in the middle of the night or early in the morning. And underneath my bed, they laid the tracks of a model railroad set. So it went underneath the bed, out into the room, back to the other end of the room, and then underneath the bed again. And so when I awoke, I don't even really have the words for it. I was beyond thrilled. I jumped out of bed. I leaped. I didn't jump. I leaped out of bed. I ran over to the transformer. I started to, make it go faster and slower and make the horn go, to. And in that moment, again, though I didn't have the words for it, I knew that I was cared for, that I was safe, that I was loved. And the therapist, again, using basic SE principles, had me really embody that experience. What did it feel like in my living, sensing body in that moment when I woke and I saw the trains going around and I leaped out? Again, I didn't have the words for it, but I knew that I was cared for and that I was loved. And then that gradually took me to a very traumatic memory when I was violently assaulted and raped as a way of scaring my father to not testify. But we were able to touch into that and touch back and forth between the body sensations of the joy, the exuberance of my birthday, and all of these very difficult sensations and feelings and images and emotions. And so I was able to, in that process, put it back in the past where it belonged, to move through it, to embody what my body wanted to do then, but it couldn't do because it was completely overwhelmed, and to put those together, and in a way that I was able to deeply heal that wound. And again, that was my Chiron. That was my asking and reaching out for the help of one of my students as a guide, as a very trustworthy guide. And I think you said something that wasn't quite, I think wasn't quite the way I quoted it, but it was close. I think you probably made it and said it better. Trauma is not so much just what happens to us, but what happens to us in the absence of that present empathetic other, that guide, that young woman who was the guide for me. That was that empathetic other. And we need that for our own healing. And in order to be that for others, again, we need to do our own healing. We need to evoke the Chiron in our lives.
Mm. Thank you for sharing that, especially the beautiful memory on your birthday. And
Yeah.
I'm deeply sorry that you had to experience that trauma. I don't know that there are really words for what you experienced, but also I'm very glad that you've been able to do the work to heal it and put it back in the past.
Yeah, trauma. That's right. And there are no words for trauma, really. Trauma is raw.
Mhm.
It's gut wrenching. And it's something that happens in the body. And that was, again, one of the key discoveries that I made was that trauma, of course, it affects the brain, it affects the mind, but primarily it lives within the body. So as a simple example, or as an example, imagine that you go outside from your house and you see that somebody is on a bicycle has injured themselves. And when you see that, of course, you call to get help, but your guts go, yuck, this gut twisting wrench. And if you see that the person is even more deeply injured, then we even go more deeply into that yuck. Now we're going to kind of go to physiology. There's a nerve in the body of all mammals, that goes between the back of the brain stem, down below the diaphragm to all of the organs below our diaphragm, but also to our heart and our lungs. It's called the vagus nerve. It's the largest nerve in the body by far. There are no nerves that are as large. And actually, Darwin wrote about that in his book, the expression of emotions in man and animals. He called it the pneumogastric nerve. In other words, gut, lungs, and he prophetically, sentiently said that it was responsible for gut wrench and heartbreak. And he was so right on, so right on. But anyhow, this nerve, that the great majority of the nerve fibers are afferent, they're sensory. In other words, they're taking information from our guts and relaying that information to our brains. And again, 80% of that nerve fiber are actually information from our organs back up to our brain to give us a reading of the state of our different organs. Again, 80% of those fibers are from the gut back to the brain. And so again, you walk out, you see somebody injured, and your guts go, yuck. Okay, the brain recognizes injury. You know, when I've worked with many military people, vets and Marines, they were much more traumatized seeing somebody, especially somebody they knew, being injured than they're being injured themselves. So we recognize injury and it sends that information down to our guts. So we see the injured person, our guts twist. But remember, 80% of that nerve is actually getting information from the guts, bringing it up to the brain, and it gets amplified. And so what starts with a yuck gets even to a yuck, and a yuck, because each time it reverberates. It's what I call a positive feedback loop with negative consequences. In other words, it's amplified. So this connection from body to brain to body, body to brain, is a powerful mediator of all of our sensations and all of our feelings. So anyhow, maybe that night we're laying in bed, and all of a sudden we notice that our guts are twisted. And then there's that image of that person that was injured. Now, this is not probably going to be traumatic, but if this is something that happens over and over again, it definitely is, or certainly can be, traumatic. So in developing somatic experiencing, SE as it's called, I look for ways to get new signals from the guts, from the rest of our body, that tell the brain that the threat is still there. So let me give you another example. You described, and I was touched by what you described, as being injured as a child, being deliberately hit as a child. And so what you may have done to protect yourself from being hit is to brace against being hit. That's what we do. That's called a defensive response. It's the defensive protective response. Now, if it just happens once or twice, our shoulders release and we don't carry that burden as a trauma. But if it is repetitious, if it occurs again and again, if it becomes chronic, then our shoulders start staying in that braced position. And then if it's held in that braced position, the person may be, after a period of time, experiencing physical pain, because that's what happens if you're tensing a certain part of the body. So if often people will come, they'll present not with flashbacks, but with bodily responses, bodily reactions, such as this protective response. So if a person comes in with shoulder pain, it's pretty common. Many people have shoulder pain. I might ask the person, well, what do you notice underneath that pain? Is there a particular tension pattern? And then the person will very likely say, yeah, my shoulder is like that. I said, okay, but now to do that very slowly, just a little bit at a time, and each time releasing it. So instead of going right into the bracing pattern, just increase the tension to the smallest amount and then letting go. And then waiting and noticing sensations, feelings, whatever comes up. And again, letting it rise just a little bit more this time, and then letting it drop back. So as we do that, we release a lot of the energy that got locked in that bracing pattern. And that energy is the energy of vitality. It's the energy of aliveness. And so when we release and complete what the body couldn't do then, it opens to this sense of aliveness and vitality. And one of the things, sometimes people have asked me, well, what's the goal of a somatic experiencing session? And they expect me to say something like, well, to erase the trauma or to discharge some of the energy that's got locked in the trauma. That's closer. But what it really is about is feeling more alive and more real. And so even with our trauma, when we learn to navigate it, then we get the benefit of feeling more present, more alive, and more real. So, of course, I don't wish trauma on anybody, but given the fact that most all of us, have experienced some degree of trauma in our lifetimes, we can, then actually use that trauma, what I call renegotiate that trauma, not relive the trauma, but to find new responses and to connect to that inner vitality. Then trauma, trauma is hell on earth, but trauma transformed can be a gift of the gods. And some of the things that I've noticed in my life's work is that very often there's an intrinsic relationship between trauma transformed and different kinds of spiritual experiences. So again, I'm not suggesting people get traumatized to have spiritual experiences, but since most all of us have some significant degrees of trauma, it does provide us this opportunity to connect with our life force, our life energy, our spiritual grounding.
I was going to say, with the example that you gave of the shoulders and releasing that energy, if vitality can be released when trauma is healed, then could trauma be described as something that keeps us from actually really living?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, trauma, again, that's not resolved, that's not transformed.
Right.
That's not, again, the term I use, renegotiate.
Renegotiated.
Yeah. Of course, that can leave us, in dysfunction, different levels, different types of dysfunction. But that dysfunction can take us to where we need to go. Again, those physical sensations this disturbing sensations that prompted me to ask my student to sit with me, that's what led to my healing. And for me to be a better guide for someone else, to be a better therapist, or however we want to call it. Yeah.
I had so many questions prepared that I wanted to ask you, and
Okay.
I feel like now we're just in the thick of it, and
Right.
I'm enjoying this so much. So I'm going to try and catch up a little bit to where I was, especially because you started speaking about somatic experiencing.
Sure.
And in somatic experiencing, you teach that the body holds a biological memory of how to complete the cycle of survival. So I wanted to ask, where do you think wisdom lives, and why do you believe that it's never truly lost, even after unimaginable pain?
Beautiful question. I was to say I believe, but it's not I believe it. I know that the body, of course, it holds stress, it holds trauma, but it also holds great amounts of wisdom.
Mhm.
We have feeling bodies, knowing bodies, intelligent bodies, and that when we learn to access that knowing, then our lives are greatly enriched. So I say the body, is an intelligent body. It's a knowing body. And not just trauma that's held in the body, but these great well springs of knowing, of what's the word I'm looking for? But I believe that we all have an instinct to heal, to move towards wholeness, to move towards a deep part of ourselves to a part of ourselves that's true and the truest. And because of the trauma and because of abuse and because of neglect, we lose that connection. But that connection is always there waiting to be evoked, to be accessed, and to be evoked. So I would say that's another part of somatic experiencing, to really contact the incomplete responses, like with, we demonstrated with your shoulder, but also to connect to this well springs. There's a Sufi saying, the body is the shore on the ocean of being. And that ocean is what we can connect through our living, sensing, knowing bodies.
What do you think healing is really asking of us and connecting with this infinite wisdom within the body?
It's asking us to attend, to be curious, to be courageous, and to trust.
I think trust is a difficult word for individuals who have experienced trauma.
That's right.
What happens in the body and how can you renegotiate trust?
Yeah. Well, gradually, slowly, little by little. There's a thing when you work with trauma. Trauma is about a constriction of the whole body-mind. And when people start to get in contact with some of the trauma, they go into a deeper contraction. Oh, here. This is a toy that I sometimes find useful. So here's contraction, here's expansion. So when the person first gets in contact with these traumatic sensations, these difficult sensations, they feel a contraction. There is a contraction. They feel the contraction. But when they're guided, as I was guided, then there's an expansion. But then another contraction and another expansion. And another contraction and another expansion. So holding these two polarities together, contraction and expansion, is what takes us to that knowing body, that felt bodily sense.
Mm. One of the most powerful stories that you've ever shared is about working with Nancy, the woman frozen in terror, whose healing helped you realize that trauma needed a different path, a path through the body. When you look back at that moment with Nancy, what stays with you most?
Very wonderful, warm memories. Nancy, psychiatrist referred Nancy to me. She'd been suffering from all kinds of, physical ailments, but also with anxiety attacks, panic attacks, so severe that she couldn't leave the house. And even with her husband, it was an ordeal. So I had been developing some relaxation techniques in the 60s. And this was with a group of men who had high blood pressure, essential hypertension, and working with releasing certain muscles, like I demonstrated with you. They were able to drop their blood pressure sometimes by 10 points, 20 points, even 30 and occasionally 40 points. Wow. So my friend, my colleague, Ed, thought that maybe some of the relaxation exercises might at least help Nancy relax and give her back some of her life. I was wrong. Relaxation wasn't the answer. Well, I started to again get her to relax. I could see her pulse from the carotid pulse going at like 120 beats a minute. And so when I started to be able to get her to relax, the heart rate went down to a more normal level, but then it shot up dramatically to even a higher level than when she came into the office. And so, what do you think the stupidest thing I could possibly have said at the time?
Relax, calm down.
That's it. So, Nancy, you need to relax. You must relax. And then her heart rate started going down. And I was relieved, but it went down. So it went down to 120, 110, 90, 80, 70, 60, 55. And her eyes were closed at the time. She opened her eyes and she grabbed onto my eyes. And she said, and I'll never forget, "Doctor, I'm dying. I'm dying. Don't let me die. Help me. Don't let me die." And in that moment, I had the following image appear on the far side of the consultation room. And it was the image of a tiger crouching, getting ready to spring. And that, of course, was the reason for my first book, Waking the Tiger. Well, how did that get awakened? Well, I said, there's a tiger. It's springing towards you. Run, escape, climb those rocks and escape. But I could see that she got even more frightened, more stuck. And so I offered virtually, I said, "Nancy, take my hand and let me just help you. And then let's just go together, climbing to those rocks, climbing them and escaping." And then her body started to shake and tremble. And then in waves of deep, easy breaths. And then her heart rate just settled to a very nice, even 72 beats a minute. Her face was a gentle, rosy color. And she opened her eyes and looked towards me, this time not grabbing onto my eyes, but connecting eye to eye. And she said, "Do you want to know what happened?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, when you told me to run, it felt like I was trying to run in quicksand, in mud, and I couldn't move. But then when you offered me your hand, I could feel my body starting to move, starting to walk, starting to run. And then I could feel my whole body climbing the rocks. And I got to the top and I knew I was safe. And I looked down and I saw the tiger. But then the image of the tiger faded out. And in its place, I saw myself as a 4-year-old child being held down to an operating table by doctors and nurses, and the ether mask forced over my face. I was suffocating. I was terrified, and my whole body had wanted to escape from that time. And so for 20 plus years, our body had wanted to escape. And in that moment, using the image of the tiger, she was finally able to complete that escape response. But one other thing that really I didn't quite realizing it at first, but she said that after the session, at the end of the session, she felt like she was being held in warm, tingling waves. And I realized that's the base of many, if not most, spiritual experiences, to be held in warm, tingling waves. And so really that session with Nancy, which I think it was 1969, was really the beginning of my exploration, which eventually became somatic experiencing. And it's something I'll never forget when I started to talk to you about it. And when she was, felt like she couldn't move, like she was paralyzed, and her heart rate was very low, I still felt a little bit of a twinge in my chest. But obviously, I know how to just let it move through. And again, it led to her healing. And for me, the beginning of developing somatic experiencing, which I then began to teach to a group of about 12 or 15 therapists from Berkeley, California. I lived outside Berkeley in a place called Wildcat Canyon. They called it my tree house. Mm-hmm. And so I would try again to be able to explain to them what I was doing and to teach them what I was doing. So from that time in 1970, 1971, it's now been taught to about 60,000 people in 44 countries. And so in my autobiography, I asked the question, have I done enough? And I can easily answer, yes, I have done enough, because it's now on the shoulder of 70 international trainers who are teaching this work in 44 countries. But there was another question. Am I enough? And I didn't have a quick answer to that. And again, writing the autobiography of trauma was a way of excavating and finding that question, to ask that question to myself, am I enough? And I must say that still I consider it to be a work in progress.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
Sure.
I think for people to hear someone such as yourself say that you're still a work in progress,
right? Definitely.
That humanizes this whole process, because what is it that you don't know? That me as a layperson, when I think about who you are and what you've done and all of your knowledge, to hear you say that, it's remarkable.
Yeah,
it really is.
In that exploration, I came to an image of myself as a 18-month-old toddler. Hold on 1 second.
Sure.
And really connecting to his vitality, his enthusiasm. That took me by the hand and said, even though it still is a work in progress, yes, I am enough.
That's beautiful. I'm glad you were able to come to that realization. It must have done wonders for you.
It did. It really brought back my vitality and the sense of an authentic self, a true self.
That's beautiful. I want to ask you something that clients may wonder, and that's when they first start working in their body, what do you think surprises them most?
Well, again, first of all, remember when they connect with the body, it's scary. But then as they're gently guided, like we did with this exercise, there's an expansion. So they go from fear to excitement. The other side of fear when it's approached in that way is excitement. And then the combination of excitement, curiosity, and courage takes people along their journey.
Mm. I think starting that journey can be extremely scary.
Yes.
And the more work you do, the more expansiveness you feel, it starts to get more comfortable. And especially if you can be held,
Okay.
as you mentioned, what most spiritual experience start to give you, that holding
That's
can be
right.
something that provides safety. And safety is
Yes,
the most important, I believe.
that's right. Like like Nancy, when she climbed the rocks and was standing on the ledge above, she looked down and she knew that she was safe. But that wasn't a thought. That was a bodily experience. Safety is a bodily experience. I mean, of course, people are sometimes in situations where there's a lot of violence going on, and so they don't feel safe. But uh, when we're not in that environment, then we can find safety within ourselves. And I think that's one of the things I would like to leave people with, to know that safety is a felt experience, an inner experience.
I think this conversation in and of itself um, can provide so much. You sharing so much, you sharing a picture of you when you were a toddler. Um, it's been very vulnerable, very healing, and very
Thank you.
open. And I'm happy to have the opportunity to do this with you. And I want to ask you this: if you could be known for one thing that would define your legacy, what would you want that to be?
Two things. One is that trauma is a fact of life, but it doesn't have to be a life sentence.
Mhm.
And that for every difficult sensation, there's an opposite sensation, like there was in the autobiography of being there at the birthday and then going into the horrific part of the trauma. That there's always a contraction, but the contraction is always followed by an expansion when we're guided carefully.
Mm.
And that's the key. Not too much all at once. So pendulation is the other thing. I think maybe I probably will be known for one thing, and that is about pendulation, which is contraction, expansion, contraction, expansion.
All right. Last question for you. If you could use your platform to educate anyone who might be struggling with their mental or emotional health and might be uncertain of how or where to start, what would you say?
Yeah. Well, um, I would say find a really good therapist. And, as I say, there are, many people that are trained in my approach, and you can go to the website, somaticexperiencing.com, to find therapists in your area. But I would just say to really ask other people who have done therapy what therapists they worked with and how that therapy has been for them. And again, if it doesn't feel right, it probably isn't right.
Mm.
you know so really, find find the right person for you. Like, as I say, I mean, again, I've developed this method. I've taught it to many, many people, but I really needed somebody to guide me, and I picked somebody who was trustworthy, and we need to find somebody who's trustworthy. So I'll leave it there. And I really enjoyed spending the time with you. Really a pleasure to have met you.
Likewise, I am so beyond grateful to have the opportunity to share space with you. Thank you for sharing your story, your vulnerability, your knowledge. If listeners want to find you online or on social media, where can they find you?
Well, somaticexperiencing.com. There are different YouTube things. Actually, there's one that might be useful for people. This is a Marine that I worked with who was blown up by 2 of these explosive devices and woke up 2 weeks later in hospital. And this was after his best friend died in his arms. And you see, it's called Ray's Story, and it's on that website. And you can see his transformation of going from somebody who's deeply traumatized to a wonderful husband and father.
Mm. I'll make sure I add that in the show notes too.
Yeah.
And then what about your books?
Oh, well, I guess they're also my first book was Waking the Tiger, Healing Trauma, and then an Unspoken Voice, How the Body Releases Trauma and Restores Goodness. And then Trauma and Memory, Brain and Body in the Search for the Living Past. I think they're all in that website. And then my most recent book, An Autobiography of Trauma, A Healing Journey, my healing journey, which I offer to everybody for their healing journeys.
Mm. Thank you so much.
Okay.
I've been, like I said, it's been a deep honor to have this opportunity. Thank you so much for the work that you've done. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for what you do. And thank you for how you do it.
Beautiful man. So walk tall, walk in beauty. Okay.